The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp autumn morning that made Frank Calloway grateful to be a farmer. He'd been up since 4:30 a.m., the rhythm of his life unchanged for 43 years on the same patch of earth his grandfather had tilled before him. The Calloway farm sat on 87 acres of prime soil in Henderson County, a kind of land developers salivated over as the nearby city slowly expanded its reach. Frank noticed the white postal truck pulling away as he returned from the eastern field. He set down his thermos of coffee on the porch railing, leaving a ring on the weathered wood his father had painted navy blue decades ago. The letter felt heavy in his callous hands, though it contained just 3 pages. Official letterhead. Legal jargon. Terms like eminent domain and compulsory acquisition that Frank understood more clearly than the lawyers who'd written them probably suspected. They can't be serious, he muttered, scanning the document a second time, his weather-lined face hardening. The letter gave him 30 days to vacate his property. 30 days to abandon the only home he'd ever known, the land his family had farmed for 3 generations. According to the document, the county had approved plans for a commercial development that required his acreage. An offer of compensation was mentioned, significantly below market value. Frank's hands trembled, not from age at 62, he was still strong as an oak, but from the cold fury building inside him. He'd heard rumors about development plans for months now, whispers at the feed store and knowing looks at church socials, but he'd never imagined they would try to take his land outright. Inside the farmhouse, he lowered himself into the chair at the kitchen table where his family had eaten every meal since before he was born. The house stood silent around him, empty since Martha had passed 3 years prior. Their children had scattered, Jennifer to Chicago, Tommy to Denver, living lives disconnected from the soil. This land was all Frank had left. It wasn't just property. It was his identity, his purpose. He reached for the landline phone that hung on the wall, its plastic yellowed with age, and dialed a number he rarely used but knew by heart. Sheriff's office, a familiar voice answered. "Joe, it's Frank," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need to talk to you. Not as my brother. As the sheriff." Sheriff Joseph Calloway was 5 years younger than Frank, with the same steel-gray eyes and stubborn jawline. Unlike Frank, who never wanted anything but the farm, Joe had left for college and returned with a badge and a sense of duty to the community that rivaled his brother's dedication to the land. "What's wrong?" Joe asked, instantly alert. Frank rarely called him at work. "They're trying to take the farm," Frank said simply. "Got some legal papers today. Says I've got 30 days to clear out so they can build a shopping center or some damn thing." The silence on the line lasted just a beat too long. "You knew about this," Frank said, accusation edging into his voice. "I heard rumors," Joe admitted. "Didn't think they'd go through with it. The council meeting where they approved it was closed door. I'm sorry, Frank. Sorry isn't going to save my land." Frank's gaze drifted out the kitchen window to the fields beyond, golden with the season's final crop. "They say they're sending people to assist with the transition next week. That's a fancy way of saying they're sending officers to make sure I don't cause trouble." "Frank, would you do it, Joe? Would you the one to drag your own brother off his land?" The question hung between them, heavy with decades of shared history and diverging paths. Frank could hear his brother's measured breathing on the other end of the line. "Come to my office," Joe finally said. "Today. Bring the papers. Let me see what we're dealing with." Frank hung up without saying goodbye, the letter still clutched in his fist, his mind already formulating what he would and wouldn't be willing to do to keep his family's legacy intact. One thing was certain. He wasn't leaving without a fight. The sheriff's office sat in a squat brick building at the edge of town, a structure that had been updated over the decades but still retained its 1950s solidity. Frank parked his mud-spattered pickup truck beside his brother's gleaming department SUV, the contrast between their vehicles a perfect illustration of their diverging life paths. Sheriff Joe Calloway's office was a modest space adorned with family photos, commendations, and a map of Henderson County pinned with colored markers tracking various ongoing concerns. When Frank entered, Joe rose from behind his desk, badge catching the fluorescent light. For a moment, the brothers simply regarded each other, seeing height, same eyes, seeing Calloway's stubbornness written across their features. "Let me see the papers," Joe said, extending his hand. Frank passed over the crumpled documents. "I want to know who's behind this, and I want to know what you're going to do about it." Joe scanned the paperwork, his expression inscrutable. 27 years in law enforcement had given him a poker face his brother could rarely penetrate. "Riverfront Development Corporation," Joe muttered. "Shell company, probably. But the authorization is legitimate. County commissioners signed off on it." He looked up at Frank. They'd followed proper legal channels. "Legal doesn't make it right," Frank retorted, leaned forward with his hands on Joe's desk. "That land has been in our family since Grandpa bought it in 1932. You know what he went through to keep it during the Depression. Joe sighed, setting the papers down. Frank, I understand this is difficult. Difficult? Frank's voice rose. They're stealing my land to build what? Condos? A strip mall? And they're using the government to do it. The letter says it's for a mixed-use development that will bring jobs and tax revenue to the county, Joe replied, his tone measured. Always the diplomat, always the voice of reason. It had irritated Frank since they were boys. And you believe that? Frank scoffed. This is Matthew Harrington's doing, isn't it? He's been trying to get his hands on riverfront property for years. Joe didn't deny it. Matthew Harrington was the wealthiest man in the county, a developer with political connections that reached the state capital. His latest project had been the talk of the county for months, a riverside paradise of luxury homes and upscale retail, promising to transform the rural community into a destination for wealthy weekenders from the city. Listen, Frank, Joe said, leaning back in his chair. This is happening whether we like it or not. The question is how we handle it. We. Frank's eyebrows shot up. There is no we here, Joe. This is my land, my fight. I just want to know if my own brother is going to be the one forcing me off my property. Joe removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The gesture reminded Frank of their father, especially when he was troubled by a difficult decision. You know I can't talk about operational details, Joe said finally, but I can tell you this isn't a simple situation. There are legal obligations I have as sheriff, and obligations you have as my brother, Frank countered, as a Calloway. Don't pull that card, Frank. It's not fair. Fair? Frank's laugh was bitter. You want to talk about fair? I paid taxes on that land for 40 years. Never missed a payment. I've served on the volunteer fire department, donated to every school fundraiser, helped neighbors when storms hit. And this is the thanks I get. A tense silence filled the office. Outside, the routine business of law enforcement continued. Phones ringing, deputies chatting, the scanner buzzing with codes and locations. But between the brothers, years of unspoken tensions crystallized in this moment. There's going to be a public hearing next Monday, Joe finally said. Before anything is finalized, you should be there. Make your case. A hearing. Frank shook his head. You know as well as I do that's just for show. The decision's already been made. Maybe. Maybe not. Joe leaned forward. But if you want any chance at all, you need to work within the system, Frank. Don't do anything rash. Frank recognized the warning in his brother's tone. Like what? Barricade myself in? Have a standoff with the deputies you send to remove me? He stood up straight, gathering the papers. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, but I'm not leaving my land. That much I know. Joe stood as well, concern evident in his eyes. Frank, please, think about this carefully. This isn't the hill to die on. That's where you're wrong, little brother, Frank said quietly. If not this, then what? Some things matter more than following orders. As Frank turned to leave, Joe called after him. I'll see what I can find out about who's really behind this. That's all I can promise. The Henderson County Community Center had never been so packed. Folding chairs filled the main hall to capacity, with dozens more residents standing along the walls. Frank sat in the front row, his weathered Stetson resting on his knee, his best flannel shirt and jeans serving as his version of formal attire. Behind him sat neighbors, friends, and farmers who'd known the Calloway family for generations. County Commissioner Richard Watts, a thin man with a permanently harried expression, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. This public hearing is now in session. Today's agenda concerns the county's exercise of eminent domain regarding several properties along the river for the proposed riverfront development project. Frank noticed his brother Joe standing at the back of the room, arms crossed, face impassive beneath his sheriff's hat. Their eyes met briefly, but Joe gave nothing away. Matthew Harrington rose first to address the room. In his tailored suit and Italian shoes, it looked like he'd stepped out of a different world than the farmers and small-town residents who filled the hall. His presentation was polished, complete with architectural renderings and economic projections displayed on a large screen. This development will transform Henderson County, Harrington declared, gesturing at images of gleaming buildings and manicured parks. 500 new jobs, millions in tax revenue. Property values will increase by an estimated 30% in surrounding areas. This is progress, ladies and gentlemen, the future of our community. Frank listened as Harrington detailed plans for luxury condominiums, a boutique hotel, restaurants with riverside dining, and high-end retail. Not once did the developer mention what would happen to the families being displaced or the agricultural heritage being paved over. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he declined the podium, instead standing at his seat and turning to face his neighbors rather than the commissioners. I'm not much for public speaking, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. But I know something about this land. My grandfather didn't buy that farm, he rescued it. The bank was foreclosing on the Hendersons during the Depression, and Grandpa scraped together every penny he had to save it, to keep a family from losing everything. Frank paused, looking around the room at faces he'd known all his life. That farm isn't just dirt and crops to me. It's sacrifice. It's heritage. It's the place where I taught my children to work hard and respect the land. Now they want to tear it all down for vacation homes for rich folks who'll visit on holidays. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. We all want prosperity for our county, Frank continued. But at what cost? Once farmland is gone, it's gone forever. And it's not just about my property. It's about what kind of community we want to be. Frank locked eyes with Commissioner Watts. I won't leave. Not for any price. And I suspect I'm not the only one who feels that way. Several other landowners in the audience nodded firmly. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as residents voiced their opinions, many supporting Frank and expressing concern about the county's direction, others arguing that development was inevitable and necessary. Throughout it all, Sheriff Joe Calloway remained silent, watching. As the meeting adjourned, Frank was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. He noticed Harrington in deep conversation with 2 of the commissioners in a corner, their expressions suggesting the discussion wasn't going as the developer had hoped. Mr. Calloway, a voice called. Frank turned to see Sarah Chen, a young reporter from the local newspaper, notebook in hand. Can I get a quote about today's hearing? Before Frank could respond, Matthew Harrington appeared at his side, his smile not reaching his eyes. Mr. Calloway, he said smoothly, extending his hand. I respect your passion. Perhaps we could discuss a more personalized arrangement regarding your property. Frank ignored the outstretched hand. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Harrington. My land is not for sale. Everything has a price, Harrington replied, his voice low enough that only Frank and the reporter could hear. And I always get what I want, one way or another. Is that a threat? Frank asked, equally quiet. Just a fact of life. Harrington's smile remained fixed. The commission votes next week. Enjoy your farm while you can. As Harrington walked away, Sarah scribbled furiously in her notebook. That was interesting, she remarked. Make sure you quote him exactly, Frank said. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the farm, Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset paint his fields in gold and amber. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. The newspaper article changed everything. Sarah Chen's front-page story detailed Matthew Harrington's veiled threats against Frank and revealed potential conflicts of interest among county commissioners. By mid-morning, Frank's phone hadn't stopped ringing, calls from neighbors offering support, local farmers promising to stand with him, even strangers from neighboring counties expressing outrage. What should have been a quiet property seizure had become a regional controversy. 3 days before the eviction deadline, a caravan of pickup trucks and farm vehicles began arriving at the Calloway farm. Men and women Frank had known all his life, and many he'd never met, set up camp in his front pasture. They brought tents, food, signs, and a determination that surprised even Frank. By sundown, over 50 people had gathered, with more arriving hourly. We're not letting them take your land, Frank declared Bill Winters, a dairy farmer from the next county. Not without a fight. The impromptu protest grew larger each day. Sarah Chen and her news crew provided constant coverage, broadcasting images of grandmothers in lawn chairs blocking the farm's entrance and children holding hand-painted signs reading Save Calloway Farm and Farmers Feed America, Developers Just Feed Greed. Social media amplified the story. Hashtag Stand With Calloway began trending across the state. Environmental groups, heritage preservation societies, and agricultural cooperatives issued statements of support. 2 state representatives called for an investigation into the county's eminent domain practices. Frank moved through it all in a state of disbelief. The farm that had been his solitary refuge for decades was now the center of a movement. He never sought this kind of attention, but he understood its power. Matthew Harrington wasn't idle. The day before the eviction deadline, he called a press conference outside his downtown office building. While I respect the right to peaceful protest, he told the assembled reporters, tomorrow's property transition will proceed as legally mandated. Sheriff Calloway has assured the county commissioners that his department will maintain order and ensure compliance with the court-approved eviction notice. The camera panned to Sheriff Joe Calloway standing stoically behind Harrington. His face revealed nothing. Is it true your brother is the landowner at the center of this dispute? Reporter called out. Joe stepped forward, adjusting his hat. I don't comment on family matters. The Henderson County Sheriff's Department will fulfill its legal obligations as always. Back at the farm, Frank watched the press conference on a volunteer's laptop. His heart sank at his brother's words. Despite their recent conversations, despite Joe's hints about helping when push came to shove, the sheriff had chosen his badge over blood. As evening fell, the protesters grew quiet, tension building with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring confrontation. Frank sat alone on his porch, watching fireflies rise from the fields as he'd done every summer night of his life. This might be the last time. The crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Frank wasn't surprised to see Joe's truck, nor to see that his brother had come alone and out of uniform. What did surprise him was the heavy manila envelope Joe carried as he climbed the porch steps. "You've got quite a crowd out there," Joe said, settling into the chair beside Frank. "Didn't ask for them. Didn't turn them away either." Joe nodded. "Harrington's furious. Called me 6 times today." "I saw your press conference," Frank replied, his voice flat. "Seemed pretty clear where you stand." Joe handed the manila envelope to his brother. "Open it." Inside, Frank found documents, financial records, emails, land surveys, and what appeared to be private correspondence between Harrington and various officials. "What am I looking at?" Frank asked. "Evidence," Joe said simply. "Harrington didn't just want your land for its views. There's coal under the eastern section, a previously unmapped seam. He's known for months. The whole Riverside Paradise is just a cover for an eventual mining operation." Frank stared at his brother. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say I called in some favors, and Sarah Chen's article gave others the courage to come forward with information." Joe leaned forward. "Frank, this changes everything. The environmental impact alone would require a whole new approval process. The commissioners were either kept in the dark or deliberately looked the other way." "So what now?" Frank asked, leafing through the papers. "We take this to the commissioners, to the media?" "We will," Joe confirmed, "but not until after tomorrow." Frank looked up sharply. "What happens tomorrow?" Winter gave way to spring, and as the land awakened from its seasonal slumber, so too did the truth. The investigation into Matthew Harrington's dealings revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Henderson County. The state attorney general's office uncovered evidence of bribery, falsified environmental reports, and shell companies designed to hide the developer's true intentions for the coal beneath the Callaway farm and surrounding properties. 2 county commissioners resigned in disgrace. Harrington faced multiple indictments. His company's stock plummeted as investors fled the scandal. On a mild April morning, Frank sat at his kitchen table reviewing paperwork of a different sort. Conservation easement documents that would permanently protect his land from development. Across from him sat his brother Joe, now something of a local hero for his role in exposing the corruption. "Once you sign these," Joe explained, "the farm can never be developed even after you're gone. It can only be used for agriculture or returned to its natural state." Frank nodded, his pen hovering above the signature line. "And you're sure this trust can't be overturned? No clever lawyer or crooked politician can find a loophole." "Sarah Chen's foundation has the best legal team in the state," Joe assured him. "They've set up similar protections for dozens of farms and historic properties. Between this and the new county ordinances limiting eminent domain powers, your land is as safe as it can be." Frank signed his name with a flourish. "Never thought I'd be grateful to a newspaper reporter." Joe chuckled. "Never thought I'd see you on the cover of Rural Heritage Monthly either, but here we are." The brothers had grown closer through the ordeal. Weekly dinners had become their new tradition, sometimes joined by Sarah, whose reporting on the Callaway case had earned her a prestigious journalism award and led to her establishing a nonprofit dedicated to preserving agricultural land. "Have you heard from Jennifer or Tommy?" Joe asked, gathering the signed documents. Frank's expression softened at the mention of his children. "Jennifer's coming for a visit next month. Says she wants to bring the grandkids to see the farm now that it's famous." He shook his head, still amazed at how events had unfolded. "Tommy called yesterday. Said he's been thinking about moving back. City life isn't agreeing with him anymore." "Really?" Joe raised his eyebrows. "Think he wants to farm?" "Don't know," Frank admitted. "But he asked a lot of questions about the East Field. Whether I was planning to plant corn or soybeans this year." The brothers walked outside into the spring sunshine. The protest camp had long since dispersed, but its impact remained. Across the county, yard signs still proclaimed solidarity with Callaway Farm. The case had sparked a movement for rural land protection that was spreading across the state. "You know," Joe said as they leaned against the porch railing, "when all this started, I was worried you'd do something reckless. Barricade yourself in, force a confrontation." Frank smiled faintly. "I considered it. Had my shotgun clean and ready that day you showed up with your deputies." "I know. I saw it just inside the door." Joe shook his head. "What changed your mind?" Frank surveyed his land, the fields waiting for planting, the trees budding with new growth, the river curving along the property's edge where his grandchildren would swim in summer, just as he had as a boy. "Realize something important," he said finally. "This land doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to the past and the future, to Grandpa and Dad, to Jennifer and Tommy and their kids, even to the community that stood with us." He turned to his brother. "Fighting for it meant doing right by all of them, not just satisfying my own anger." Joe nodded thoughtfully. Dad would be proud. Of both of us, I think. He would, Frank agreed, though he'd never say it out loud. Not his way. Too bad about your neighbor Wilson's place, though, Joe said, changing the subject. Heard he sold to that organic farming cooperative. Frank laughed. That was my doing, actually. Put him in touch with them after he mentioned wanting to retire. Better than letting some developer get a foothold. Well, I'll be damned, Joe grinned. Frank Calloway, community organizer. Don't get carried away. I'm still just a farmer. Frank squinted at the horizon. Though I did agree to speak at that land preservation conference next month. Sarah was persuasive. She usually is. Joe checked his watch. I better get these documents to the courthouse before they close. As Joe walked to his truck, Frank called after him. You coming for dinner Sunday? I'm smoking a brisket. Wouldn't miss it, Joe replied, climbing into his vehicle. Frank watched his brother drive away, then turned his attention to the farm that had been